James stood beside his wife's casket, his hands clasped tightly before him, feeling the quiet ache of loss settle deep into his bones. The room was filled with the soft murmur of mourners, friends and family offering condolences, each one a reminder of the life he and Margaret had shared. Margaret's life had been, in his eyes, the embodiment of constancy and grace. She had been a private woman, but with him, she was open, warm, endlessly giving. Now that warmth was gone, replaced by a cold, hollow emptiness he couldn't fill. "Hi there. I'm Goldie, and welcome to Goldie's Love Stories." James barely noticed the young man approaching him until he felt a hand on his shoulder. He turned, meeting the gaze of a stranger. The man looked to be in his early 30s, with a serious, searching expression. "Mr. Taylor?" the man asked, his voice steady but soft. "Yes," James replied, his brow furrowed. He didn't recognize the young man and couldn't place him among Margaret's friends or relatives. "I'm Tom," the young man continued. I'm sorry for your loss. I didn't know Margaret very well, but I wanted to come today." James nodded, acknowledging the kindness. "Thank you for coming," he replied, assuming Tom was just another mourner touched by Margaret's life in some way. But the young man didn't walk away. He lingered, his eyes searching James's face with an intensity that made him uneasy. "I need to tell you something, Mr. Taylor," Tom said, his tone shifting to something more somber. "I didn't come here today just to offer my condolences. There's more to it than that." James's confusion deepened, and he glanced at Tom, waiting for an explanation. Tom drew a breath, then said, "Margaret was my mother." The words hit James like a punch. For a moment, he was speechless, certain he must have misheard. "Excuse me," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I know this must be a shock," Tom continued quickly, "but it's true. Margaret was my birth mother. I only recently found out myself." James took a step back, his mind reeling. "That can't be right," he murmured, his voice rough. "Margaret and I had no children. She would have told me if," he shook his head, disbelief etched into every line on his face. Tom didn't falter. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a carefully folded document, offering it to James. "I know this is difficult to believe, but I found this birth certificate. Margaret's name is on it. I was adopted shortly after I was born, and I only found out about her recently. I wanted to meet her, but I was too late." James took the document with a shaky hand, barely able to focus on the words in front of him. There it was, clear as day, Margaret Taylor, listed as the mother. His heart pounded as he scanned the paper, its unyielding truth almost mocking his disbelief. He looked up at Tom, studying him now with new eyes. There was something faintly familiar in the young man's features, maybe a shadow of Margaret's eyes, a hint of her quiet intensity. But still, he couldn't accept it, not fully. "This doesn't make sense," he murmured, half to himself. "Why would Margaret keep this from me?" Tom's face softened. "I don't know, Mr. Taylor. I'm sorry if this is coming as a shock. I didn't mean to add to your grief." James took a steadying breath, trying to gather his scattered thoughts. The pieces didn't fit. Margaret had been honest, devoted. Why would she hide such a monumental secret? And yet, as he looked down at the birth certificate again, he couldn't deny the proof staring back at him. "Why now?" he finally asked, his voice hollow. "Why come here to her funeral and tell me this?" Tom's eyes softened with understanding. "I didn't want to disrupt anything. I wanted to be here, to pay my respects. And I thought you had a right to know." James felt his stomach twist, a mixture of grief and confusion churning within him. He took a step back, needing air, needing space. His gaze drifted to the framed photographs that lined the tables around them, memories of Margaret through the years, smiling, laughing, her eyes filled with warmth. It was like he was seeing her for the first time through a lens he hadn't known existed. His mind raced back to a time decades ago, when he'd taken that overseas assignment, leaving Margaret behind for 2 long years. It had been difficult, but she'd been so supportive, writing letters, sending him updates, never once mentioning anything amiss. Could that have been when? He shook his head, feeling the ground shift beneath him. "Look," he said, his voice a touch steadier, though still laced with disbelief. "This is a lot to take in. I'm not saying I believe it. Not yet. But I'll talk to you. Later. After this is all over. Tom nodded, his gaze unwavering but understanding. Of course. I don't want to cause any more trouble for you. James watched as the young man drifted back into the crowd, his mind spinning with questions. The funeral moved on around him, voices blending into an indistinct hum. But he felt separate from it now, his mind filled with memories he hadn't thought of in years, moments from the past now clouded by the weight of this revelation. As he stood there, surrounded by the life he had shared with Margaret, a chilling realization crept over him. There were parts of her life, parts of her soul, he might never have known. And with this young man's arrival, those secrets buried with her, had clawed their way to the surface, leaving him with questions he feared he might never be able to answer. In the days that followed Margaret's funeral, James found himself haunted by the young man's revelation, a quiet disquiet growing within him. He couldn't shake the memory of Tom's words or the birth certificate he'd shown. The pieces didn't fit, and the questions gnawed at him. He couldn't rest until he knew the truth. So, he did the only thing he could think of. He called his sister Ruth. Ruth was older than James by a few years, always the voice of reason and often the keeper of family secrets. She answered his call right away, her voice warm yet tinged with the sadness they both felt for Margaret's passing. She was sympathetic to his confusion, inviting him over with a sense of urgency he hadn't expected. When he arrived at her modest, sunlit home, Ruth greeted him with a long, understanding hug. They sat together in her cozy kitchen, where she placed a cup of tea in front of him, studying his face with the knowing gaze only a sister could have. James, she began, her voice gentle but steady, what is it you need to ask me? James looked down at the tea, searching for words. Finally, he took a deep breath. Did you know Margaret had a child? The question hung between them, heavy, pressing. Ruth didn't flinch, and as she looked at him, her face softened, guilt flickering in her eyes. Yes, she said quietly, her voice barely more than a whisper. I knew. The admission struck him, even though he had somehow sensed it the moment he'd asked. You knew, he repeated, almost to himself, as if trying to grasp the full weight of it. All this time. Ruth nodded, her gaze drifting past him, as if lost in the memories. I knew. Margaret came to me when she was pregnant. She was heartbroken, James, completely torn apart. You were overseas, and she was alone, scared. She didn't know what to do. James felt his chest tighten. He wanted to interrupt, to question everything, but he could see that Ruth had more to say. She was barely making ends meet on her own back then, Ruth continued, her voice thick with emotion. Your savings had run dry, and every day she struggled just to keep the lights on. She'd skip meals some nights to stretch the little money she had left, and even then, it was never enough. When she found out she was pregnant, she didn't want to tell you because she knew you'd come rushing back, giving up everything. But even if you had, it would have still been the same struggle. James looked down, a swell of emotions pooling within him, imagining Margaret, alone and carrying a child in the cramped apartment they could barely afford. The Margaret he'd known had always been the resilient one, the one who took each challenge in stride. Yet, here was a side of her he'd never imagined. Ruth leaned forward, her hands clutching her tea as if drawing strength from its warmth. She was terrified, James. She felt she had no right to bring a child into a life like that. Every month, she worried if the rent would get paid, if she'd even have a roof over her head. She didn't want her child to grow up with that kind of uncertainty. James swallowed, his throat tightening. Why didn't she tell me? Why did she keep this from me? Ruth reached out, her hand gentle on his. She was trying to protect you, James. She thought telling you would only hurt you. She didn't want to lay that burden on you, not when you were already working so hard, trying to build a better life for both of you. And once she decided, there was no turning back. Margaret felt she had no choice. What did she do? He whispered, afraid of the answer. Ruth took a steadying breath, her fingers tracing the rim of her teacup. She gave him up. She arranged for the adoption through a local agency. I tried to convince her to wait, to talk to you when you came back, but Margaret was so determined. She thought it was the best choice, for everyone. James felt a rush of conflicting emotions. How could she think that was best? How could she keep something like this from me? James, it broke her heart, Ruth said softly, her voice wavering. But she was also certain it was the right choice. Margaret was haunted by it. She kept tabs on him, through letters and reports from the adoption agency. She knew he was close by, but she never had the courage to reach out. He stared at his sister, the reality settling into him like stones sinking in water. All those years, all the moments he'd shared with Margaret, and she'd been carrying this burden alone. How had he not seen it? "I can't believe it," he said, shaking his head. She watched him grow up?" Ruth nodded, sympathy in her eyes. Yes, in her own way. She felt it was enough just to know he was safe, that he was happy. But I think she always carried a small hope that one day she might tell you. Maybe she'd even try to meet him herself. The words left him feeling hollow, lost in the unfamiliar territory of a life he'd never known. How many times had they sat in their home, sharing stories, talking about the future? And through it all, Margaret had kept a part of herself hidden, buried beneath layers of love and pain. As the hours drifted by, Ruth continued sharing details, small fragments of memories she'd kept locked away. Finally, when the daylight had waned, James returned home, his mind a whirlpool of thoughts. He felt exhausted, as if he'd lived a dozen lifetimes in a single day. But as he passed through the familiar rooms of his house, he noticed things he hadn't seen before, small mementos of Margaret's life he'd never questioned. And then, almost on instinct, he went to her sewing room, a quiet corner where she'd spent hours piecing quilts together. There, in a dusty box tucked away on the top shelf, he found a bundle of letters tied with a faded blue ribbon. Hands trembling, he untied the ribbon, recognizing Margaret's careful handwriting on the envelopes. These letters weren't addressed to anyone, they were simply thoughts, confessions, a running monologue of her inner world. And as he read, his heart both broke and healed with each page. In the letters, Margaret poured out her regret, her pain, her endless questioning of whether she'd made the right choice. She described Tom, though she never named him, sharing the pride she felt when she heard of his milestones through the adoption agency. She wrote about her fears, her love for James, and her sorrow at keeping such a painful secret. James set the letters down, his eyes wet, his heart heavy with the realization of her struggle. She had been so much more than he'd ever known, so much stronger, so much more complex. And yet, he couldn't bring himself to feel anger. Instead, there was an overwhelming sadness, mixed with a strange, fragile compassion. Margaret had carried this secret for so long, had made an impossible choice to protect them both. The next morning, with the letters still echoing in his mind, James picked up the phone. He dialed the number Tom had left him, waiting as it rang. His heart beat steadily, and though he still felt the weight of his questions, there was a new determination in his voice. When Tom answered, James took a deep breath and spoke, his voice steady. "Tom, I'd like to meet. I think there's a lot we need to talk about." James sat across from Tom in the small cafe they'd chosen to meet in, his heart thudding in his chest. The conversation with Ruth had opened a floodgate of emotions he'd barely managed to process himself, and now here he was, about to share them with this young man who had lost even more. Taking a deep breath, he began. "Tom, I talked to my sister. She told me everything about Margaret's choice. She wanted you to have a life that she couldn't give you, not when I was away. She believed it was for the best." For a moment, Tom just stared at him, his expression unreadable. Then something hardened in his eyes, and his mouth set into a grim line. "So that's it? She had me, decided I was too much trouble, and just handed me off." "No," James replied, his voice firm but gentle. "Margaret was alone and struggling. She didn't know how to raise a child under those circumstances. I think she hoped you would have a better life than she felt she could give you." Tom's jaw clenched, and his gaze drifted toward the window. "Do you know what it's like to find out that the woman who gave birth to you was living practically down the street? That all this time I could have," he broke off, his voice thick with emotion. "That's the hardest part. Knowing she was so close, but she chose not to see me." James felt a pang of guilt, one he couldn't quite place. "If I'd known," he said quietly, "I would have tried to convince her to make a different choice. I didn't even know I had a son, Tom. I can't change that, and neither could she. I only wish she'd felt she could tell me. Maybe things would have been different." Tom's gaze snapped back to him, his eyes sharp with accusation. So what? You just go off for 2 years and come back to, what? Live happily ever after while I get shipped off to a stranger's home. James recoiled slightly, the words hitting him like a punch to the gut. It wasn't like that, Tom. I was doing what I thought was best for us at the time, for our future. Your future, Tom muttered bitterly. Meanwhile, I didn't even know who I was. I spent years wondering about my family, imagining what you might be like. And now I find out you're just, here, living this whole other life while I've been left with nothing but questions. The bitterness in Tom's voice stung, and James struggled to keep his own frustration in check. He understood Tom's anger, but it felt unfair, misplaced. Yet, he knew this was a storm they would have to weather if there was any hope of building a bridge between them. Tom, he said slowly, choosing his words with care, I can't go back and change what happened, and I don't expect you to accept this overnight. But Margaret, she made that choice because she believed it was best for you, not because she didn't care. She followed your life from a distance, checked on you in her own way. You meant everything to her, even if she couldn't be with you. Tom's expression softened for a brief moment, but anger still simmered beneath the surface. It's hard to believe that, he said quietly. Hard to accept that she could love me and still leave me. They sat in silence, the weight of Margaret's absence palpable between them. For James, the revelation had been painful enough. To imagine how it must feel for Tom was nearly unbearable. Yet, he also felt an odd kinship with the young man. In some twisted way, they had both been left out of Margaret's life in different ways, both of them blindsided by secrets that were meant to protect. After a long pause, Tom spoke, his voice softer, almost vulnerable. I don't know how to move forward from this. I spent years hoping to find her, and now I find out she's gone, and you're all that's left. James felt a flicker of hope, though he suppressed it quickly. I don't have the answers, Tom. I don't know if there's a way to fully make sense of what she did or why she did it. But, if you're willing, I'd like to get to know you. I'd like us to at least try. Tom glanced down at the table, his fingers tracing the edge of his coffee cup. He took a deep breath, his shoulders rising and falling as he weighed James's words. Maybe, he said quietly, maybe we can. But it's going to take time. Of course, James replied, a small but sincere smile breaking through his somber expression. There's no rush. Just, one step at a time. A tentative silence settled between them, but it was no longer filled with the sharp edges of blame or resentment. Instead, it held something fragile, something that both men were reluctant to disturb, an unspoken understanding that neither of them could change the past, but maybe, just maybe, they could start to build something from it. As they finished their coffee in quiet companionship, each man caught between grief and hope, James felt a sense of purpose he hadn't known since Margaret's passing. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a warm golden glow over the graveyard as James and Tom walked side by side, the air thick with unspoken words. Each step felt heavy yet lightened by the knowledge that they were no longer alone in their grief. They approached Margaret's grave, a modest headstone etched with her name and the years of her life. It was a small patch of earth, yet it felt immense with the weight of their shared history. James paused, his heart racing as he took in the sight of the grave. He had come here so many times, mourning the loss of his wife, but today felt different. Today he was not just here to grieve, he was here to honor a woman who had touched both their lives in ways they were just beginning to understand. Beside him, Tom stopped, his expression a mix of sorrow and determination. Are you ready? James asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Tom nodded, but his eyes remained fixed on the ground. I guess I have to be. As they stood together, James felt an unfamiliar sense of connection to this young man. Tom was a reflection of Margaret's choices, a living reminder of the secrets she had kept. I've missed her every day, he said finally, his voice thick with emotion. She was my partner, my best friend. And now, I'm just starting to see how much she carried alone. Tom shifted, his gaze lifting to the headstone. I can't believe I'm just now learning all this. It's like she was always so close, but she never reached out. I want to be angry with her, but it's hard when I know she was scared. James exhaled slowly, the pain of his own memories mingling with Tom's frustrations. She loved you, you know. I didn't realize it until I spoke with Ruth. Margaret's choice was born out of fear and love. She thought it was what was best for you, but it didn't mean she didn't think about you every day. A silence enveloped them, punctuated only by the rustling leaves overhead. Tom knelt beside the grave, placing his hand on the cool stone. "I wish I could have known her," he murmured. To hear her side of the story, to understand why she thought she had to do this alone. James sank to the ground beside Tom, the weight of their emotions pressing heavily on his chest. "So do I," he admitted, the ache in his heart raw. "We were both left in the dark, and it's easy to feel betrayed. But we're here now, and we can choose how we remember her. We can honor her together." Tom looked up, a flicker of hope in his eyes. "You're right. I've spent so much time wishing for answers when I could have been learning about her from you." With that, James felt the last vestiges of resentment fade away. "Let's share our memories," he suggested, a smile breaking through the heaviness of their grief. "I can tell you about the time she tried to surprise me for my birthday and ended up burning the cake. It was a disaster, but she laughed it off and turned it into a funny story. She had a way of making everything feel lighter, even in hard times." Tom chuckled softly, the sound lightening the atmosphere between them. "I would love to hear that. I only have the little bits I've learned from my adoptive family. They were good to me, but it's not the same." James felt a swell of gratitude for this moment. "How about this? I'd like to invite you into my life. Let's create new memories together, share stories about her, and perhaps discover who we are to one another in the process. Your family, whether we like it or not." Tom's eyes widened in surprise, and a cautious smile began to emerge. "Are you sure you want that? I mean, after everything?" "Absolutely," James replied, determination setting his jaw. "You deserve to know who you are, and I want to be there for you. Let's not let Margaret's choices define us. Instead, let's honor her memory by building something new. We can figure it out together." As they rose from the grave, a renewed sense of purpose surged between them. They had both been hurt, but now, standing side by side, they were determined to move forward. James could feel the last vestiges of bitterness melting away, replaced by a burgeoning hope. The sky was painted in shades of orange and pink as they walked away from the graveyard, leaving behind the weight of unanswered questions and regrets. Each step felt lighter, infused with a sense of camaraderie that had grown between them, a bond forged in shared pain and the desire to heal. Tom glanced at James, a newfound determination in his eyes. "Let's start with dinner next week. I want to hear about all those moments you had with her. Maybe we can try making that cake too." James laughed, the sound ringing out like a bell. "I think we'll need to practice first, or we might end up with a kitchen disaster like she did." And for the first time since Margaret's passing, James felt a warmth blooming in his chest, a flicker of family he never expected to find. Together, they stepped into the twilight, ready to explore the road ahead, united in their memories, bound by their shared history, and open to the possibilities of tomorrow. Thanks for watching. How would you rate this story? Give it 1 to 5 hearts in the comments and let me know what you thought. This is a brand new channel, and your support means the world to me. If you enjoyed the story, please consider subscribing and turning on notifications so you never miss an episode. Your likes, comments, and shares help this community grow, and I'd be so grateful to have you along for the journey. See you next time.